has actually been kind of in this neutral position, I guess. Polarized family, but McKelty and Tony are still hanging out with.
Welcome back to my channel. What we're about to break down today isn't just another piece of reality TV drama. It's a raw, unfiltered exposure of a family dynamic that has been quietly unraveling for years inside the world of sister wives. When Madison Brown Brush went public in October 2024 and called her stepmother Robyn Brown a liar, she didn't hesitate, she didn't soften it, and she definitely didn't try to protect anyone's image. Her words were blunt, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. Robyn is a liar. The end. Now think about that for a second. In a family that has spent over a decade managing public perception, carefully choosing words, and avoiding direct confrontation on camera, Maddie completely shattered that pattern in a single sentence. There were no disclaimers, no, this is just my perspective, no attempt to balance both sides. Just a flat-out accusation that carried years of emotional weight behind it. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. It didn't feel impulsive. It felt calculated in the opposite way. It felt like someone who had spent years observing, processing, and holding back, finally deciding that enough was enough. Because when someone reaches the point where they are willing to publicly call a family member a manipulative liar, especially in a family this visible, it means something has fundamentally broken. This wasn't about drama. This was about truth, at least Maddie's truth, being pushed to the surface in a way that could no longer be ignored. To really understand why Maddie's words hit as hard as they do, you have to understand her position in the Brown family, because she's not just another voice in the crowd, she's one of the original witnesses to everything that changed. As the daughter of Janelle Brown and Kody Brown, Maddie grew up during the early years of the family's plural marriage, long before Robyn Brown entered the picture. She experienced firsthand what the family looked like before the shift, before the emotional balance changed, before attention and priorities began to move in a different direction. And that matters, because when Robyn joined the family in 2010, Maddie wasn't a child who would simply accept the new normal without question. She was a teenager, around 14 or 15 years old. Old enough to observe, old enough to compare, and most importantly, old enough to remember. She had a clear mental picture of what life was like before, which means she could see the difference as it unfolded in real time. She watched how relationships evolved, how time and attention were redistributed, and how certain dynamics began to shift in ways that weren't always obvious on camera. And over time, those observations don't just disappear, they build. They form patterns. They create conclusions. So when Maddie speaks now, she's not reacting to a single moment or misunderstanding. She's speaking from over a decade of lived experience, from years of watching how things played out both publicly and privately. That's why her words carry a different kind of weight. This isn't speculation. This is someone who saw the before, lived through the after, and is now calling out what she believes really happened in between. But what truly takes Maddie's accusation to another level is the way she describes Robyn's behavior, not just as dishonest, but as consistently and strategically manipulative on a psychological level. She doesn't frame it as occasional lying or emotional exaggeration. Instead, she presents it as a constant pattern, something that happens every time Robyn speaks. And when she says that if Robyn's mouth is moving, she's manipulating, that's not just an insult. It's a complete dismantling of trust. It suggests that in Maddie's experience, there is no such thing as neutral communication when it comes to Robyn. Every word, every explanation, every emotional reaction is, in her view, part of a calculated effort to control how situations are perceived. And then comes the part that really stands out, when Maddie says that this manipulation is so effective that it leaves people unable to tell up from down. That's not just about lying. That's about altering someone's sense of reality. That's about creating confusion to the point where people begin to question their own understanding of events. In psychological terms, that's incredibly serious because it goes beyond disagreement and into the territory of perception control. And for Maddie to make that claim publicly, it suggests that she's not just frustrated, she's certain. Certain enough to put it out there without fear of backlash, without trying to soften the impact. And when someone speaks with that level of certainty, especially about something this personal, it forces people to stop and ask, what did she see over those years that led her to this conclusion? Because accusations like this don't come out of nowhere. They come from patterns that repeat so many times that they become impossible to ignore. As this situation unfolds further, the focus inevitably shifts toward Kody Brown because Maddie's accusations don't exist in isolation. They directly collide with the version of events he has been presenting publicly on Sister Wives. In a recent episode, Kody described his relationship with Maddie in a way that painted himself as the one being pushed away. He claimed that she had essentially taken her children and scuttled them away from him, suggesting secrecy, distance, and even a kind of intentional exclusion. He went as far as saying that she never told him about her pregnancy, never kept him informed about major life events, and positioned himself as a father left in the dark. On the surface, that narrative might sound sympathetic, like a parent being unfairly shut out. But the moment you begin to compare that version of events with what other members of the family have revealed, the cracks in that story become impossible to ignore. Because according to Janelle Brown, the issue isn't that Maddie suddenly became secretive or distant. The issue is that Kody himself has been absent for years. And that changes everything. It reframes the entire narrative from one of rejection to one of consequence. Because when a parent is not consistently present, when they don't show up for birthdays, milestones, or even basic communication, the relationship doesn't just stay the same. It deteriorates. It fades. And eventually, it reaches a point where the expectation of involvement disappears entirely. So when Kody expresses shock or hurt that he wasn't informed about certain life events, it raises a deeper question. Is he genuinely unaware of the impact of his absence? Or is he choosing to focus on a version of the story that allows him to avoid taking responsibility? Because from Maddie's perspective, and from what has been suggested by others in the family, this isn't about a daughter shutting her father out. It's about a father who gradually removed himself and is now struggling to accept the consequences of that distance. And this is where the contradiction becomes not just noticeable, but undeniable. On one hand, Kody presents himself as someone who has been wronged, someone who has been cut off from his daughter and her children without explanation. But on the other hand, there is clear and consistent testimony that he has not been actively involved in their lives for a significant period of time. According to Janelle, he has been absent from the life of Maddie's daughter for over 3 years, a detail that completely shifts the context of everything he claims. Because absence on that level isn't accidental. It's not a misunderstanding or a scheduling conflict. It's a pattern. And patterns have consequences. Relationships don't survive on occasional effort. They require consistency, presence, and emotional investment. Without those things, communication naturally breaks down and trust begins to erode. So when Kody expresses frustration about not being informed of major life events, it comes across not as a justified grievance, but as a reaction disconnected from the reality of his own behavior. It creates a narrative gap, one where his perception of events doesn't align with the experiences of the people around him. And that gap is exactly what Maddie's accusation seems to be pointing toward. Because if someone genuinely believes a version of events that contradicts observable reality, then something is influencing that perception. Something is shaping how they interpret situations, how they assign blame, and how they understand their own role in what's happening. And that brings us back to the core of Maddie's statement, not just that Robyn is a liar, but that her influence is so strong, so consistent, that it alters how others see the world around them. In that context, Kody's narrative doesn't just seem incomplete, it seems constructed. This is exactly where Maddie's accusation about manipulation becomes the central piece of the puzzle, because she isn't just criticizing behavior, she's describing a system of influence that operates quietly but powerfully over time. According to her, this isn't about a few misleading statements or occasional dishonesty. It's about a consistent reinforcement of a specific narrative, one where Kody Brown is positioned as the victim and everyone else is framed as the source of conflict. And when that narrative is repeated often enough, especially in a close relationship, it begins to feel real. That's how perception is shaped, not through one dramatic lie, but through repeated validation of a distorted perspective. If Kody expresses frustration about his children and Robyn Brown responds with agreement rather than challenge, that reinforces his belief. If he frames himself as misunderstood or mistreated, and that framing is consistently supported, it becomes the default way he interprets every situation. Over time, that kind of reinforcement can make it incredibly difficult to step outside of that perspective and see things objectively. And that's what makes this dynamic so significant. Because it suggests that the issue isn't just conflict between family members, it's a breakdown in shared reality. Different people are operating with completely different versions of what's true, and those versions are being strengthened by the relationships they're in. From Maddie's point of view, this isn't accidental, it's intentional. It's calculated. And it's effective. Effective enough to reshape how a father sees his own children, effective enough to create distance where there was once connection, and effective enough to maintain a narrative that places responsibility everywhere except where it might actually belong. What makes this situation even more compelling and, frankly, more difficult to dismiss is that Madison Brown Brush is not the only voice raising concerns about these dynamics. When multiple individuals from the same family, with different personalities, different experiences, and different relationships to the central figures, begin describing similar patterns, it starts to look less like personal bias and more like a shared reality. Over time, several of the Brown children have spoken publicly about feeling a shift in how their father, Kody Brown, interacts with them compared to how he interacts with Robyn Brown and her children. For example, Gwendolyn Brown has openly expressed the emotional impact of watching her father show a level of presence, patience, and attention toward Robyn's household that she feels she did not receive growing up. That kind of observation isn't just about favoritism, it's about contrast. It's about witnessing a version of a parent that feels unfamiliar, even though it's the same person. Similarly, Paydon Brown has acknowledged the imbalance in attention and the way priorities seem to have shifted over time, suggesting that the emotional center of the family moved in a direction that didn't include everyone equally. And then there's Michael T. Brown Padron, who at one point was considered one of the closest bridges between the different sides of the family. Even she has begun to speak in a way that highlights the lack of accountability in Kody's relationships with his children, emphasizing that acknowledgement and responsibility could go a long way in repairing those connections. When you step back and look at all of these perspectives together, a pattern begins to form. It's not just one child feeling hurt or misunderstood. It's multiple children describing a consistent shift in behavior, attention, and emotional availability. And when those experiences align, even loosely, It adds weight to Maddie's claim that something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something that goes beyond individual disagreements and points toward a systemic issue within the family dynamic. And the consequences of that pattern are not small. They are massive, measurable, and impossible to ignore. According to statements shared within the family, Kody Brown is now estranged from the overwhelming majority of his children, with estimates suggesting that as many as 90 to 95% of those relationships are either broken or severely strained. When you consider that he has 18 children, that statistic becomes staggering. It means that only a small handful of those relationships remain intact, and even those appear to be closely tied to one specific part of the family, his life with Robyn Brown. That kind of outcome doesn't happen randomly. It doesn't happen because of one argument or one misunderstanding. It happens as the result of long-term patterns of behavior, communication, and prioritization that gradually reshape how relationships function. When children feel consistently overlooked, unheard, or secondary, those feelings don't just disappear. They build. They accumulate over time until they reach a point where distance feels safer than connection. And once that distance is established, rebuilding trust becomes incredibly difficult, especially if the underlying issues are not acknowledged or addressed. This is why this situation has reached such a critical point. It's not just about hurt feelings, it's about the near total collapse of a family structure that once presented itself as unified, even if imperfect. And when you see that collapse happening on such a large scale, it forces a deeper question. What kind of environment leads to this level of disconnection? Because when nearly an entire group of siblings shares a similar outcome in their relationship with one parent, it suggests that the issue isn't isolated, it's systemic. What Madison Brown Brush ultimately brings into focus with her statement is not just the idea that Robyn Brown lies, it's the possibility that those lies contribute to the creation of an entirely different version of reality within the family. In this version, Kody is not a father who has grown distant from his children, but a victim of their rejection. In this version, the children are not reacting to years of absence or imbalance, but are instead being influenced by negativity, gossip, or misunderstanding. And in this version, Robyn is not a central figure in the shift of family dynamics, but someone who is unfairly blamed for problems she did not create. The power of this kind of narrative lies in its consistency. When the same framing is applied again and again, when every conflict is interpreted through the same lens, it begins to feel like truth, even if it contradicts the lived experiences of others. That's what makes Maddie's accusations so significant. She's not just disagreeing with Robyn, she's rejecting the entire framework through which events have been explained. She's saying that what has been presented as truth is, in her view, something constructed, something shaped, and something maintained through ongoing influence. And when you look at the gap between what Kody believes about his relationships and what his children are saying about those same relationships, that possibility becomes harder to ignore. Because when two versions of reality exist side by side, and one consistently minimizes responsibility while the other consistently points to the same patterns of behavior, it raises an uncomfortable but necessary question about which version is closer to the truth. In the end, what makes this entire situation so powerful is not just the accusations themselves, but the clarity with which they are being delivered. Madison Brown Brush is not asking for sympathy, she's not trying to negotiate, and she's not leaving the door wide open for reconciliation without change. Her words suggest a level of acceptance, an understanding that the relationship with her father, Kody Brown, may not be reparable in its current form. And that acceptance doesn't come from anger alone, it comes from recognition. Recognition of patterns that have repeated for years, recognition of behavior that has not changed, and recognition of the impact those patterns have had not just on her, but on her own children. She has even spoken about seeking professional support to process the situation, which indicates that this is not a reaction driven purely by emotion, but one grounded in reflection and personal growth. And from that place of clarity, she has made a decision, not necessarily to cut ties completely, but to set boundaries based on what she believes is healthy and sustainable. That's what gives her statement its weight. It's not just a moment of frustration, it's the result of years of observation, experience, and ultimately, a decision to speak her truth without filtering it for public comfort. Whether people agree with her or not, the impact of her words is undeniable. Because when someone who has lived inside a situation for over a decade finally speaks with that level of certainty, it forces everyone watching to reconsider what they thought they knew.